Hey everybody, welcome back to Backlog Bench. I'm your boy Abram, joined as always by Mr. Tucker Hazel. And we're here today to, I would say, if I had to sum it up, Tucker, pontificate about the state of games and this sort of often talked about idea that maybe there's going to be a video game crash. We want to sort of interrogate this idea, think about what would happen if there were indeed a crash, and I guess also more broadly whether we think that this is something that's actually realistic. Because it's been talked about a lot, sort of in light of the pretty mass instability across particularly AAA game development, with massive layoffs, obviously, but also the underperformance of games, the sort of challenges that games are encountering both in development and release. I think it has people sort of looking back, and it's sort of in an odd way at the video game crash in 1983, almost as like a mental model for how we reset a lot of the things wrong with gaming. And I think that is a peculiar idea.
Well, it's interesting because there aren't too many examples in just, I don't know, history and culture period where a reset point like this has happened. I mean, I don't know, the Great Depression, you might count that. But, we persevered back in my day, a.k.a. the Great Depression.
Tucker's actually 104 years old.
I'll let you know the cream that I use afterward. But I also think it's important to contextualize this around that 1983 crash, which is, whether intentional or not, the context I think people are kind of referring to when they say a crash might end up happening, given how unstable the current games industry market is. And here's just some bullet point notes of doing some research that I came up with the major effects of the 1983 crash. And we will maybe discuss what the parallels would be if another crash kind of like this were to happen in the current market. But in 1983, during that crash, Magnavox stops making games.
And to be clear, Magnavox was making hardware.
Yes, and they were making like the original. The Magnavox Odyssey is the earliest home video game console. Yeah. They weren't particularly relevant by 1983, so I think they were kind of already going out of the way anyway. But that is a major player that stopped making games or stopped being involved in the industry because it seemed as if the market was completely gone by that point. Activision, the first third-party company, downsized significantly and shifted their focus to PC game development away from making cartridge-based games for things like Intellivision and Atari. Atari themselves, obviously the dominant games force of the early 1980s, laid off 30% of their 10,000 strong workforce. And also Warner Bros., who owned Atari at that time, sold Atari to, I believe, just like an investor guy that ended up continuing on. But that is definitely the strongest parallel that I think we'll be able to draw is massive layoffs and a selling from a bigger company because it just seems like it's not really worth it anymore. Many stores, physical stores, stopped selling games because this is not worth it. They had a lot of stock on the shelves that people just simply weren't buying, and they got out of that business. And then the major thing that is really what the one bullet point to sum up the entire 1983 crash is the total industry revenue dropped from $3.2 billion in 1983. 2 years later, in 1985, before the NES came out, $100 million. And so this is like a 90+% decrease in total spending on video games, where very, very clearly something was majorly wrong, and almost no one who was purchasing games in the early 80s was doing so in the mid-80s before Nintendo was revitalizing. And so if we were to draw the clearest parallel here, do you actually, is that what you're typing, know what the current total spending on video games was in 24?
Oh boy, no, I was looking at something different, but I think I was
total video game spending 2024, almost $60 billion.
There we go.
And so that would be $2 billion, $1 billion, something like that. Almost the entire spending on video games just completely wiped out.
Yeah,
if there were to be a commensurate crash,
it'd be very drastic. I mean, I think that what I was checking,
that's underselling. Very drastic is underselling what a 97% drop in.
It'd be completely catastrophic.
Yeah,
I was looking up to verify here. The Magnavox Odyssey had released in 1972. Arcades as a phenomenon were really coming into their own around the end of the 70s. So there was a lot of concern over whether video games as a whole were just a fad, just sort of a passing fancy in toy design. So the idea that stores would stop selling them wasn't too crazy, right? It was this toy that was, about a decade, a little bit more than a decade, depending on who you ask, into its life cycle. So the point that I think you're aptly making is that this is not a commensurate situation by almost any means.
Yeah,
and
you can draw some parallels to the points I was making, which I do want to do, and see maybe, again, if something like that were to happen, what would the parallels be?
Exactly.
But there's a lot of these elements, especially one thing that's larger and situational that we're definitely going to be getting into, that makes it nearly impossible, I think, as you're indicating, for something like this to even possibly happen. Which is that this didn't really apply to markets outside of the U.S.
Yeah.
The Famicom Entertainment, Family Computer System.
Family Computer, Famicom.
Yeah, no, but it had like a continuation to the name. Yeah. I was getting mixed up with NES. The Famicom releases in 1983 in Japan is immediately very successful there, and also European markets with their home computer industry. Japan and Europe were barely affected by this. And so it was not a global thing. It was really particularly the U.S. that was impacted by this.
Yeah, and I mean, back in this period, gaming was still quite global, particularly looking at arcades and the arcade manufacturers from particularly Japan that were making strides. But it was a very nascent games industry. It's hard to map the modern context of games onto this classic context of games, particularly just because I think that people do it not only without this context that we've been providing, but I think also kind of for the wrong reasons. Because even if you're taking sort of a U.S. lens to the crash in the 80s, the release of the NES in 85 meant that the crash was not only not a particularly grand period of time, but it was also immediately followed by something that was way better, a way more solid future that the industry as we actually know it now was built upon. And I think it's very rosy, as I was sort of alluding to at the beginning of the conversation, to suggest that this could happen again, right? And that in doing so, in crashing, in suddenly snapping our fingers and losing $58 million in spending almost overnight, that we would somehow sort of crawl out of the ashes with something that is drastically better. Because that's the important note. What came out of the crash was drastically better, but it was also seeded in the crash and pre-crash era. Again, as you were saying, the Famicom launched the same year as the crash, right? So I just think that people are a little silly with it. I think we're getting a little silly, but I think it is still worth, Tucker, because people are talking about this so much, to talk about some of those things that might be parallel, might make people think that we are headed towards a crash, similar to how people... I don't know if people felt this way, because I don't barely know anybody that's like the fucking crazy age of like 42 or 43. Actually, no, if you were at 42 or 43 now, you would be like 2, and I don't think they were worried about the crash. Too.
Yeah, like my parents were... teenagers when this was happening. So,
but let's think of, and really what we're doing is we're trying to lead you. You can't lead something about leading the horse to water, but we're going to lead you, the viewer, through a Google document we made here, because we did a little bit of brainstorming about sort of the analogous factors that I think people are feeling and identifying right now that make them think we're going for a crash.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like, why is this even being brought up at all? And I would say it's really only been the last maybe 2 years that I've heard this sort of mentioned. And it's been since late 2023 through 2024 and into the current year, 2025, the amount of studio closures, layoffs from major studios, and high-profile game failures, high-profile games being low quality at launch, these sort of factors that are coalescing in the current time period that give people a very... uncertain concept of what the current industry is, and then drawing that out and being like, well, if it's so bad now, what will force change to happen? And then the hypothetical is, if we were to a crash to happen, which would mean everyone stops spending money on games and force all of the major players to either completely abandon the industry or change so radically that a future would then be a superior thing. And everything that I'm saying here isn't with our points, which are mostly going to be, this is not feasible, a crash wouldn't actually help, what kind of things can we expect or could we expect to come out of that. My point isn't to say with any of this that the current games industry doesn't need major change to be better and stronger in the future, but is that the idea of a video game market crash that forces so much to happen, given the different context that we're in now as opposed to over 40 years ago, wouldn't be the answer. That wouldn't actually cause these things to happen that people want to happen, that I want to happen, the changes that I want to see impact the games industry for a stronger and better future for everyone involved. A crash, I don't think, as we'll kind of break down here, would lead to almost any of those ultimate solutions or ultimate improvements.
Yeah, and I mean, we have 8 things written down here as big factors that I think people are identifying. Some of which kind of maps onto the context in the 80s, but a lot of which doesn't. I mean, I think the things that do most directly correlate are sort of the more business-sided things that I think a lot of players don't really care about, right? Because I think a lot of people look at, like, the E.T. game on Atari, which is broadly responsible as, like, the game. If you had to pin the crash on one game, it'd be that game, right? Yeah. But it's not that game was bad. Obviously, it was very bad, but the issue is more broadly that it was a symptom of how this new, unregulated market of games couldn't really sustain people being wrong about a game like E.T. to the extent that they were. This was a time of monetary inflation. It was a time of very little control around unlicensed software flooding the market. Yeah. It was a time when the only means of discoverability was walking into a store, right? So if everything on that shelf is this massively overproduced E.T. game, you're kind of fucked, right? So there's a lot of issues and a lot of solutions that Nintendo brought forth to prevent unlicensed games, to put some kind of control on how much was flooding the market, right? And a lot of those problems just don't exist now because we've sort of worked them out, or they sort of crop up in ways that are less relevant. Like the Steam shop being flooded with all kinds of random bullshit is a massive problem, but those things aren't directly gunning for, you know, what Activision, EA, Ubisoft, they're not being destabilized by like hentai games. But there are some factors, some larger economic factors, some larger regulatory factors that are similar. I mean, a big one is that there's this Wall Street Journal piece recently talking about how spending in the last, I think it was last 12 months, among people our age, 18 and 24, a big demographic for gaming, obviously, is down by over 25% year on year, which is sort of indicative of a larger culture of inflation and cost of living crisis. Yeah. A lot of things that are priming the pump for people to generally spend less on games, which is not good when some of our other factors here, dev timelines are so long, budgets are so big, and headcounts are so big. So there's factors outside of just, is the game good, that are way more pressing on whether or not gaming as a whole is in an unstable place, and like, oh, you don't like how they monetize to this, that, and the third. That's like kind of almost barely relevant, I think.
Yeah. It's money.
Yes.
That is the root of all of the strengths and weaknesses of the video games industry, but currently it is budgets and game pricing. That's another element, and console pricing that people are really worried about right now. And are there any of these that you want to like focus in on and sort of explore in terms of issues right now?
I mean, I think we should keep talking.
Conversation.
Yeah, let's keep talking from the player side. I think your point about costs being too high is a very prescient one right now. I mean, Nintendo has certainly found themselves at the epicenter of pricing discourse for the last 2 months.
Yeah. So for current context, if you're listening to this in the future, we are a little over a month and a half removed from the launch of Nintendo Switch 2, which launched at $450, alongside Mario Kart 8, which is an $80 video game, one of the very first. And certainly like the first really high profile one to launch at $80, which is more than likely going to cause as we look back, like, oh, that's where it started.
I mean, we even know Outer Wilds 2 is...
That's
Outer
true.
Worlds 2 is in the 80.
Yeah, correct, yeah. And so there's a lot of people saying, and time will tell how much this change impacts the success of games going forward. It seems to have not impacted Mario Kart World almost at all. But that people will not be buying games if these prices continue to increase. Specifically because prices of major video games were very, very constant, actually. One of the most constant and long-lasting no price change that I can think of is the $60 AAA video game that, as far as I know, and I don't know the exact era in which prices then changed to $60, but at least stuck around for 15 years plus. As long as I can remember, up until the launch of PS5 and Xbox Series, games were $60 at their maximum, and that was my entire concept of video game pricing. And now we've gone from the change to 60 to 70, which largely happened with big games around 2020, 2021, to just a few years later, Nintendo making the push to $80. And 70 seems to have not really been a breaking point. And
people talked about it like it was, but it ended up not being.
Well, of course, yeah. And I would wager that 80 is going to be harder to take given how quickly it happened after 70, but I think it depends on the project, and I think that 80 will still not necessarily be a barrier, but this is definitely on the player side. The biggest thing that's like a worry for the future of the industry is if people will even be buying games if they cost comparatively so much more than what a quote-unquote similar game did 6 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, and there's this other report that I think is important to bring into conversation with this that, I don't remember if I have it here or not. Yes, here it is. This is from PC Gamer, and they're reporting on this firm that aggregates data and does player surveys called Newzoo, talking about how 92% of game time on PC is spent on older titles.
Oh, yeah.
And there's this interesting breakdown here of how that actually is broken down. So this is from the window January to December 2024. 67% of play hours on PC were spent on a game that was 6 years or more old. Further, 25% of player hours were spent on games that are 2 to 5 years old. The remaining 8% of the time was spent on games that are less than 2 years old. Wow. So it's obvious that because people have greater economic concerns than buying games, and because there is such a sort of wonderful selection of free-to-play or still supported legacy games to choose from, on PC, which is by far the biggest platform for playing games, in a more hardcore capacity, obviously mobile will be bigger than that, but if we're talking about people who are really dialed in, who would be germane to this conversation, I think, in large part, you're looking at PC, and those people are opting to go elsewhere. And they go on to say that like Counter-Strike / CS2, League of Legends, Roblox, Dota, Fortnite, these are games that are big in that soup there.
Yeah, of course. And what we're talking about there isn't necessarily games that are 6 years old. It's particularly 6 years old or older when you get something like League of Legends, which came out in 2010, 2011, something like that. Of course, Minecraft, also still one of the most played games. Not available on Steam. Can you imagine if that happened? That'd be crazy. If they put Minecraft on Steam.
Yeah, I'm somewhat surprised that Microsoft hasn't done that, actually.
Yeah. But these games that are not only just like, okay, they started their popularity during PS4, but a lot of these games have been supported for nearing on 15, 20 years at this point. And so this is something that has been growing as these games are maintain their popularity and don't really shrink too much, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so people's attention are getting captured elsewhere. And so I think that this is also not helping this broader perception that gaming is an unstable place. I'm curious I was talking about perception versus reality. Because I believe when we were looking at this data recently, you can see a massive fall off in money invested into the gaming industry post-COVID when there was a big bubble. However, spending on games is somewhat stabilized.
It's steady.
Between years, right? So I think that there's a lot of things at play here, but I think a big portion of that is how we're perceiving the challenges in the gaming industry. Because a lot of this stuff is very much massive objective issues with the industry. Yeah. The layoffs, I think, are the biggest one. It's sort of inescapable to talk about the sort of the modern landscape of games and how games are being made without talking about the real flippant way that labor is being treated, particularly outside of Japan, because within Japan there are much stricter labor laws. Yeah. It's not just that companies
as well in Europe.
Yeah, it's not just like companies like Nintendo or From or Capcom. These companies really lauded as being at the top of how they treat their Japanese employees. Yeah. It's not just that they're wonderful companies, it's also that it's much harder to fire those people. It's a cultural difference, right? But it's important to note just what's lost in that process. That talent that maybe doesn't return to the gaming industry, that leads to a lack of institutional knowledge, that sort of erodes the foundations, right? I mean, there's been a lot of talk about Donkey Kong Bonanza to this effect in a positive way, particularly on Blue Sky, with people saying, man, this is the sort of game you can only get when you have people who've been working at Nintendo for decades, training people who are younger than them, building up this next generation of talent. We see that across Nintendo. We see that across a lot of places in Japan. You don't see that so much in these studios that are relying on revolving doors of contracted labor, that are having these protracted, ridiculous budgets and development cycles. Halo Studios being a key example. We were looking just the other day at the credits for Halo Infinite. The number of support studios in the credits for that game is almost unbelievable.
I will, I don't know if I'll remember to do this when we edit this, but either I will leave a link to the Moby Games credit list for Halo Infinite, or you can Google Moby Games Halo Infinite if I don't do that.
It's not a big lift.
I want to be helpful, but also if I'm not, you can do it.
Yeah.
Just peruse. Just scroll. Just see how many times you have to hit the little scroll wheel on your mouse and / or your thumb. How many strokes of the thumb it takes to move down the page. Because that is, for me, the thing that I am most apparently worried about for the current moment, which is particularly caused by, as you were lightly mentioning earlier, the over-investment into video games and to new hires, into expanding teams during 2021 and 2022, especially as we saw so many people at home playing games and spending massively went up. The then subsequent reaction, because this is a chain reaction, people are at home, spending goes up, investors see how much spending has gone up, like, I want to be a part of this. Let's give these teams a lot more money, because the idea is that with more team members, with more heads, you can make a stronger product. You can get things out faster. You can produce more content. That's concept, at least. And so that goes up. Then, frankly, pandemic ends. People stop being at home and spending as much on game, playing as many games. And that goes down. And then the reaction is there are way too many people once the investment leaves, because they're not seeing the same level of revenue. The investment leaves, and it's like, well, we don't have the investment. We can't pay that massive amount of people that we've suddenly hired. So now we have to, quote unquote, right size. We have to get back down to around the level or even smaller than we were 2 years ago. And that's where the majority of these layoffs come from, is over-investment. Of course, there are other sources that we'll talk about as well. But the games industry ballooned and didn't have the funding or even the player interest to actually support the thousands upon thousands upon thousands of extra people that were suddenly being paid to make games. And so then that I use this in not necessarily the worst way, the bad way that it sounds, but shedding the weight that has been added, because there's not the funding to support all these people.
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting, because this is a conversation that I brought up in the Skybox Critics Discord server. Because I was curious to get some people's thoughts on this situation, and there was an interesting point that was being discussed in there about this idea that, yes, these people are being laid off, but at the same time, they're being laid off at the end of a project, and then these other projects are scaling up and looking for talent, and there's this cyclical movement, right?
Of course.
Where the industry is unstable, but there is interest in that talent for work down the line. And so the industry is kind of in this perpetual state of losing and gaining people, whether that's contract laborers, whether that's more full-time employees of the studio. There's a real lack of interest or ability to retain people beyond the scope of a project. And I think that is quite bad, particularly when you look at it in the context of an industry that's also trying to consolidate itself, right? I mean, I think maybe the thing I've regretted the most of anything I ever said on BLB was me being anything other than completely against the Microsoft activations that they've done. I think in the past I was way too interested in what it meant for me as a player and the benefits I would reap without thinking about what Microsoft was actually sowing, which is complete calamity. You made a really good video recently about how their most recent string of layoffs is maybe the worst day for gaming ever. And I think there's a really strong case for that, because we're sort of seeing it's not just about that one moment, it's about what that one moment also represents. It represents this overextension into Activision, into Bethesda, these companies that we were sort of doing this experiment the day just casually together. Would either of these teams have been anything other than better off if Microsoft hadn't bought them? And I think the answer is no. And so this is an area where regulation, just as we're talking about how regulation in the past needed to happen for games, I think regulation in the present needs to happen too. And the gutted FTC under the Trump administration needs to get good again, frankly, without Lena Khan. They need to figure out someone to do it.
Godspeed to those people.
Yeah, because there's no doubt that if there's one massive exploitation of this sort of labor, and that's destabilizing at a grand scale, a lot of sectors of the industry, it's Microsoft taking these teams on, or even, as we were saying, Sony. What good was Bungie being acquired?
Though you also then have to be like comparatively real and be like, Sony buying Bungie? Yeah, that was not good for Sony or Bungie, it seems, but like, we have to remember that Microsoft bought Activision, all of Blizzard, all of King, and all of Bethesda.
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right.
Like all four of those are bigger than Bungie.
the scale's not the same, but also if you think about it, the amount of games that were clearly at the whim of the discretion of Bungie and the leadership that brought Bungie into the fold, completely inorganically. Also, if you just like pound for pound, canceled game to canceled game, PlayStation is probably out ahead.
Oh yeah, in some capacity, yeah.
So there's just no doubt.
I do want to mention something. What we're talking about now, as we've established here, this is what we see as the worst element of the current gaming industry, and why I don't necessarily blame people for, to some degree, overreacting and saying that a crash needs to happen or that a crash is coming, because this is really bad. Probably the worst and least stable the video games industry has been since 1983. But what I see in this moment is not a crash, because again, spending is very consistent, and that's the major thing that was what signified the crash in the early 80s, is spending massively decreasing. This is a bubble popping of these AAA studios needing to be smaller because of over investment, because of monopolization. The balloon expanded and it pops and has to shrink back down. This is not a crash. This is a shrinkage. And I think those two things are very, very different. And why I see this bubble popping and not a crash.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I'm just thinking of the episode of Seinfeld where George gets out of the cold pool and he has shrinkage, and this woman sees his shrunken penis and he starts yelling about shrinkage. It's a really good episode. Go watch the episode of Seinfeld. I don't remember the title of it, so go watch every episode of Seinfeld, and if you do that, you will find this one.
That's true.
But the
process of elimination. The
point you're making is a really key one, because the other big refrain out of me bringing this topic to the Skybox Discord server, which I think is really astute, is a lot of people are saying that the moment we're in right now is what, per what is possible, a crash looks like. That we are ostensibly in the worst of it. It's not a crash, really, in the sense that this isn't a sort of complete falling on the face of, but at the scale that the gaming industry is at the importance that it holds as an entertainment industry, as a sort of a capitalist venture, it will never flatline and then rebuild from that point. It'll just continue to sort of march ahead in the way that it's going. And as you were saying, as I think is unfortunately true, continuing to have branches pruned off of it to keep the tree alive. Because I think that if I had to put my thesis on the discussion at this point, is that it's simply impossible for the industry to crash. Like, at minimum, like it did. And I think even if you think about it right now, it's just not. I don't really see a reality where a crash means anything more fundamental. And to be clear, this is fundamental, but any more fundamental than Microsoft no longer having a presence in hardware in games. I think that's what the crash looks like. I think again, the United States being taken out of the forefront of the gaming industry is more likely, and I guess in that way similar to a crash, but this is going to happen over a long time horizon. I think we're in this for a while.
And so I think it also would be good to use what knowledge we have of where this conversation has happened, again, in our very hardcore circles, and what people generally think that a crash would mean in the current context. I do think that our friends on the Skybox server are probably right, that this is the quote-unquote worst of it, right? We are looking at it happening in the moment, and it's very, very bad. But if we were to draw that parallel from the 1983 crash to something more drastic happening, a lot of the exaggerated, and not necessarily in a positive or negative way, but exaggerated goals for if a current crash were to happen would seemingly, from many people that I've heard talk about this, be that a lot of these established AAA gaming companies that are not treating their employees particularly well, that are canceling projects, that have way too long of development timelines for things to be supported properly. That's Warner Brothers, that's Activision, that's everything under Microsoft. That's a lot of Sony studios are experiencing that right now. For that, all of these teams would ostensibly have to 180 on what they are doing, is shrink their budgets and shrink their dev timelines. And for a lot of the desires for people is stop investing so much into live service games, because that seems to be draining so much of the energy away. To what direction, for what reason, that's definitely something to dig deeper into. But there are definitely these things that seem to be what people would want to see out of a crash, with the hope, of course, that then it would be able to be built back better. But primarily, these AAA teams need to be fundamentally changed. And the reason why, again, you mentioned your thesis, I don't think a crash is possible, is that these teams are too established now to 180 in the way that they are. They are big, slow-moving ships that shift, and we're seeing major shifts, but they're in the way that you were saying that the reason why it was so quote-unquote easy for things to happen in a major way in the 80s is because video games were a fad. They were relatively new. That is not the case at all anymore. They are literally the biggest entertainment medium on the planet, and most of that, or a lot of that, comes from American gaming companies. Things are too rooted in culture and investment and literally buildings and computers and all this physical investment to 180 in the way that I think people would want to see out of an idealized crash, of all these teams being able to be more nimble and sustainable and less bulky.
Yeah, I mean, people talk a lot about Clair Obscur in many peculiar ways. And I think one that I think
lots of Lune's feet.
Lots of Lune's feet, absolutely. There's one line of thinking that I think is particularly interesting to get into, which is this idea that even the true team size of Clair Obscur, which is about 400 some odd people, is like an ideal team size. And I would agree in part. It depends on the project. Of course, what we're talking about here is not one size fits all solutions, but there's no doubt that if we were looking at teams of hundreds instead of teams of thousands, a lot of the issues regarding game production would be intrinsically better, right? The budget would just simply be smaller, right? And you'd hope then that the scale is smaller and then the timeline is shorter. Not always the case. But the point is, having that smaller head count would be good. The issue, of course, as you were talking about this idea of this big monolithic studio, how do you go about piecing up a development team of 3,000 into 4 teams of a little less than 800? Like,
Yeah.
can you even, is that even something you can do? The answer is probably no. How do you shift so much specialized talent to more generalized positions? Where do you go about, how do you go about training people in that team to take up these senior leadership roles you would need on smaller projects? How do you go about that? I think I don't know if you can, and this is what I think part of why the idea of a crash is sort of romantic, right? In sort of a perverse way of thinking, because if there's a crash, then there's no choice but to shrink everything, and then what comes out of there is able to be something better. But as it exists now, if we sort of operate under this thinking that I operate under, at that these outcomes, maybe if they are inevitable, like a Microsoft completely, being dissolved in a gaming sense, it's going to take forever. And I don't know how you would go about reorganizing. I just don't think it's possible. And I think that's one of the big challenges that the medium of games faces at AAA level, broadly speaking. If you want to put Final Fantasy in conversation with Expedition 33 from production side, sure, but there's enough people that made Final Fantasy VII Rebirth to make 7 Clair Obscurs concurrently. But those 3,500 people can't be split up that way.
Yeah. Because a lot of people will hear exactly what you're saying, that you could hypothetically, with that Square Enix team, make 7 Clair Obscurs and be like, well, why aren't they making 7 Clair Obscurs? It's like, well, that team is not equipped to make 7 Clair Obscurs. And so let's dive a little deeper into specific things. I think that's a good place to start. What we're going to talk about in this section of the video is, again, in an idealized crash that some people romanticize to happen for building a better future, what would be the ideal impacts? As we're mentioning, smaller team sizes, right? That would be one of the major things I think that people would start with, is teams like Ubisoft's gigantic teams that are spread across the entire globe, the amount of studios and collaborative studios and then support studios and contract work that goes into something like the yearly Call of Duty games that are now a collaboration not just between Infinity Ward and like Raven supporting, but then Beanox and Solid State and Raven and then teams supporting them and generating textures and all this stuff. That these projects are so gigantic now that people and I agree with this definitely, but that there needs to be some sort of smaller size in order to prevent the damage that because what ends up happening is when you have such a deep investment in so many people's lives and jobs invested in creating one thing, if it does not go well, as frankly I kind of presume like the new Battlefield is not going to meet the expectations that they have for it. Okay, 7 studios are working on that. You made some studios to work on this project. What is going to happen to all of these people when you're investing all of their work into one thing? Smaller dev size, smaller team size for these large projects is one of those idealized things. And yes, while I agree, hypothetically, I would like that, I don't think, as we're mentioning, it's necessarily feasible.
Yeah, I mean, the Battlefield one is interesting, or Call of Duty is interesting, because there's an argument, I think, specifically.
Whoa.
Try again.
Specifically.
Sometimes you gotta take a third whack at a word.
Okay, Daffy. Specifically
looking at Battlefield, which is so far past its apex of popularity that it does not sort of dictate the input. The output doesn't dictate the input currently.
Yeah.
That's where, if I were running EA, I would be trying to untangle that yarn and say, okay, all of these studios like Motive or Criterion, one of those two, which I think is shut down, but let's just say for the sake of
Criterion's
argument,
on its way.
let's just say for the sake of argument, neither is.
Motive's making Iron Man. For how long? I don't know. But...
Well, that's the interesting thing, right? It's like some of these teams get absorbed into these larger cross-team projects. If you untangle that knot and you put them back on the things that people wanted from them when they were individual entities, probably the most clear one is a Dead Space 4 or Dead Space 2 remake from Motive. You could be having these smaller wins helping to support your portfolio instead of putting everybody onto what I think is probably a failed venture. I mean, they said that they want 100 million players on the new Battlefield. I mean, that doesn't even make fucking sense, man.
No, I think there might be something wrong in translation there, to be honest.
Well, I mean, to me, that basically, and this is a sidebar about Battlefield, but this to me that says, okay, this game is going to be free to play, and this game is going to be targeting a massive global launch in regions like in Asia where people play PUBG at an unprecedented scale. And in the U.S., it wouldn't even be a factor. But the point is,
I don't even think I know anyone who's played PUBG in the last 6 years.
Yeah, but there's literally tens of millions of people who are playing it constantly.
Right now.
But the point is, some of these I think you could untangle, right?
Yeah.
And Activision's the biggest one. I mean, how many times have we heard about a Toys for Bob or a Vicarious Visions getting cannibalized into a Call of Duty engine? And then think about the success of the Crash Bandicoot games. Like, imagine if they had just been allowed to put out another fucking Crash Bandicoot game.
Do you know what happened to Vicarious Visions?
No.
Which was an Activision? I do.
Huh?
They became Blizzard Albany.
Whoa.
And they work on... wow. They were a studio that people liked for some of their recent work, and then they became the prime example of what you're saying of, we need bodies to support the machine.
Yeah.
And so, okay, they made games that you like, but now they're going to make this game. And we're gonna get rid of their fucking name because they're no longer have an identity.
And if our I would call him a rapscallion of a friend, Botox Games, is any indication, he was talking about the recent Tony Hawk's 3+4 version, talking about how Iron Galaxy, the developer of that, did a good job, but said that it's not Vicarious Visions, and you can tell. Like, you can feel the loss of these teams from a player side and a production side. And so I think that, that's it's not easy to do that, right? But it feels achievable that you could pick those locks, right? But where it gets tricky, right, is that if you just have a team that is, broadly speaking, too unwieldy, all you can do is lay people off, and that's not the solution you want. You don't want institutional talent getting lost, that knowledge getting forgotten. You don't want specialized developers who might be amazing at, like, water physics or, like, particular physics interactions or texture work. You don't want them gone. What do you do in that case? I think in that case, from my view, the realistic thing to do is actually what Nintendo even came out and said that they were going to do. I would say the blueprint for sustainable game development is Nintendo right now.
Sure, yeah.
And even they recently in Investor Q&A said, hey, we're investigating shorter timelines, development timelines for a lot of our games. And it does seem realistic. Like when you start to hear about how EPD 8 has been cooking on Mario Kart World for 8 years, or how Donkey Kong Bonanza is similar. Now, you're not talking about 8 years of active development, but I think, what Nintendo's identifying is even our biggest teams could be moving faster. And Sean Layden spoke about this too a number of years ago. Limit the scope, limit the time, put that same group of people on a smaller project moving faster. Do 2 projects in a time that makes 1. Imagine if Sony Santa Monica had gotten to do 2 God of War games in a time that took to do 1, and then they're on to the next thing already. That would be such an injection of capital for their studio, and it would be more games for the player. Like, there are achievable things on the scope front that I think could happen to help get teams. If you can't make them smaller, make them faster.
Yeah. And here's what's most interesting about this, because not obviously, but what you're saying is my ideal video games industry.
Yeah.
Where these big teams with amazing talent are just squeezed a little bit tighter, not in terms of head count, but in terms of preventing bloat. Yeah. In terms of your game is going to be 40 hours long, make it 30 hours long. Cut 18 months off of the development. Yeah. And so then you're moving just that little bit faster. The interesting thing is even though I think that is feasible and achievable, that does not mean it doesn't also come with risk, or not with risk, with caveats, right? There's pros and there's cons to all of this. And the thing that I think is really, really fascinating, and why, even though, again, it's not ideal to me, I understand why these decisions aren't made, especially at these big teams making the biggest projects, is on a player side, there is this desire for each subsequent game from a team to be bigger, more content, better lighting, better textures, up and up and up and up than whatever the last one was. And the reality is that we may see a lower return on investment. And I think this is where the teams get scared, right? Is like, we know that people generally want to see a prettier game.
Yeah.
They want to have a little bit more content than whatever we did the last time. Let's make sure we give them that, because hypothetically, if we give them something that maybe looks a little bit worse in terms of visual fidelity than our previous work, or is a little bit smaller than our previous work, they won't see it as that next big thing to invest their time and money into, and then won't buy the project as much. Even if it cost a little bit more to make, we might not see as much return on investment. And so, and the problem with game development as it stands, not problem, just reality, is that it's an exponential curve in terms of how much time and investment you have to make in order to get to that next level of fidelity and content and success. There's a reason why 3 GTA games came out on PS2, and then, just a few later you get 4, and then Red Dead, and then GTA 5, and then, I mean, even just looking back, 5 years between GTA 5 and Red Dead 2 sounds hilarious. And now we're looking at 7 for GTA 6. Like, these things are exponential. It takes more and more effort and more time, because it's more complicated to make a more complicated tree than a less complicated tree. But you want the more complicated tree because it's better than the less complicated tree, whatever that means. And so this is a sliding scale where if there does have to be a sacrifice that is made. And if that is in fidelity and complexity and content and length and scope, they're worried about that risk where will people even invest in this if it is smaller and does look worse, whatever that means.
Yeah, I mean, this is where it gets really tricky, because I again, it comes back to the idea that the crash, the narrative around a crash exists in the hardcore circles, where also a lot of these complaints that you're talking about live. But are these the right players to be beholden to, I think, is a large part of the question. How many people in our hardcore circles looked at Spider-Man 2 and was like, this is derivative, this is too similar. It gets a lot of accolades, but that's also a game that is in a sort of more hardcore space criticized. But you can't talk about that game as anything less than a massive success, because it's selling to people that are far outside any sort of dialed-in discourse about reused animations or about reused maps or scales of content. Like, are the people who are in your live chat or in your social media mentions, these people even matter at a certain point? And it'd be interesting to me to see if, Rockstar put out a GTA game that was minute in scale, if that wouldn't be a massive success. We talk about cultivating brands and IPs a lot in games. I mean, that is huge. At a certain point, you have to cash in on that. I don't mean that in a negative way, but simply say people love these worlds so much that if we give them the next installment in it, even if it is perhaps 25% shorter than the last one, A, how many people are even going to beat the game to know that? And B, if they if they do, are they even going to care if it is a singular and meaningful experience? I think that it's just, to me, scope is at this point the easiest thing to compromise on. It's the thing you can compromise on that changes your workflow the least. Yeah.
No, I totally agree. I think I wanted to present the sacrifices and the potential harm of those sacrifices, but I also agree that is the area where I see the most room for comparatively easy repair. Yeah. Right? I think some of these things are a little bit more fundamental, but the upside is every time you sit down with your team to work on that design document and plan out what this next project is going to be, you have the chance to shift your angle a little bit and say, look, last time was too big. Let's say, we had 250 side quests in the last game. Let's make it 180 and see how our players respond to it. Get it out again in a year faster or whatever.
Well, here's the interesting thing, because I think about a game I'm really, really looking forward to here in a couple of weeks is Mafia: The Old Country.
Oh, sure.
I think the game is going to rock, and they've been really... it's Hangar 13, right? It's currently...
Correct.
Yeah, Hangar 13 and 2K have been really open about the fact that this is a concise, linear, third-person shooter action cinematic narrative game.
Yeah.
They've also, on the back of that, priced it at under traditional retail price for a game.
Yeah.
But it's $50.
$50? Okay.
I think. Let me double check that, because this is really the crux of my point. If I'm wrong, my point doesn't make sense.
No, I think
Mafia,
it is.
The Old Country, PSN, $50. I'm right about that.
Yeah.
that game. Now this is where I win myself no favors with the average player of games. That game should be $70. Because here's the thing.
Yeah, everyone's gonna fucking hate you for that one.
If you compromise on scope and then you also compromise on price, are you getting ahead? That's what I'm unsure about.
Oh, interesting.
This is what I'm saying. Because you got what Nintendo has. Nintendo is so interesting to be at the forefront of increasing cost. Because they are also the ones that are doing it with the games that, per the sort of vocabulary of the average player, are least deserving of doing so. Like Mario Kart World, we both think is a tremendous game and it offers you a lot of value, but it is not at the sort of level of fidelity or the level of scope that I think your average person engaged in the gaming discourse would accept the price increase in the back of. GTA 6 was, I think, in everybody's mind, the one to do it because it's going to be the biggest, most realistic, most groundbreaking thing ever. But Nintendo did it because they said, our creativity, our vision, our mechanics, our ideas are worth more money. It doesn't matter how they look. It doesn't matter how you perceive them. We can tell you they're worth that much money. And as you were saying at the top of the discussion, clearly it is. People are buying.
Yeah.
I understand that Mafia is a smaller property. I understand that it's closer to a AA scale production.
Mario Kart?
Yeah, if you can believe it. But I think that there's an argument to be said that, scope your game appropriately, but don't sell people on the compromise. Sell people on the fact that this is something you can sit down and you can achievably beat. And you're going to have a meaningful narrative experience from. And sell it at a price that's going to make you a bigger profit. I think that there's a tendency in this conversation to get so anti-capitalist that we don't reach a meaningful solution.
Yeah, what I think is interesting about that particular example, and I think actually can also bring into conversation another game releasing around that time that has the same kind of design emphasis, which is Techland's Dying Light: The Beast, which is not Dying Light 3. It's not, I think it's around the scope of the first game, smaller than the second one. I don't really know enough about it, but I know it's supposed to be a smaller project that it compared to what a Dying Light 3 hypothetically would be. But the interesting thing about these two games is, and the reason why I think they're both budgeted a little bit smaller, is that what the teams are trying to do is break that cycle, right?
Yeah.
Is you tell the players, yes, it's a little bit smaller, we're going to cost a little bit less, but if they do end up seeing that return on investment, and they understand that people want this, then I think you can start working back up. But I think the sacrifice is, we know this is technically a break from what the desire for that next entry is. And we have to sacrifice somewhere to maintain that balance with the players. One thing I don't really know how this factors too much into it, but it was with Mafia: The Old Country. It actually is the longest in development Mafia game.
Is it?
I don't know about Mafia 3 actually, because I think that one shifted teams or something. But with Hangar 13, their first game was Mafia 3. 4 years later, Mafia Definitive Edition. And now 5 years later, Mafia: The Old Country. Is 5 years the small time scale to make one of these games?
Right.
How much money actually went into making this? 5 years sounds... It took less than that to make God of War Ragnarok, which is not a game that compromised on scope. And so the questions start being raised about these projects, which I'm interested in and excited about, and think that they do signal that ideal, little bit smaller scope thing that we want to see from these teams. But it costs more to pay people to work on games now than it did when you're making Mafia 3.
Yeah.
Is the budget actually smaller for Old Country versus Mafia 3? These are questions I'm kind of asking.
Yeah, I mean, these are all really good questions. There's maybe a case, because we just saw Helldivers 2 be a massive success at a $40 price point last year. There's maybe
that game was in development for 10 years.
Yeah, so there's maybe an argument that the lower price point in onto itself is a marketing gimmick, and that what you sell in volume makes up for the deficit in per unit price. But I just think that I like your point about sort of getting people used to or willing to entertain this smaller scope, and I think that's important by its own right. But I just think that at the same time, there has to be a little bit more willingness to lead with your quality and say, look, we made this great game. It's a smaller game, but that's actually to your benefit. You have so many games to play. You have so few hours in the day. This 10 hours, you're going to see it through, and it's going to mean a lot. And that $7 you spent with us per $10, if that game was $70, it's going to mean more to you than if you bought Assassin's Creed Shadows and you played it for 15 hours and you saw 30% of the game. Like I just think that we have to decouple this relationship that the average customer of games has between amount of game and value of game. I think that that's really at the heart of a lot of issues with game production.
I agree. And that I actually will say when we're talking about how easy it would be to quote unquote fix things, I think unfortunately that is the most fundamental aspect of gaming culture right now that is causing things to go the way that they are. Because what you mentioned earlier, right, is there are so many options for very good games that you can play for cheap or that you likely already have or can obtain for cheap because they're older, where you can play them for 5 times as long, 20 times as long, 100 times as long as Mafia the Old Country, and only spend literally none on them or only a fraction of what's going into buying a game like Mafia. And as you're mentioning, the amount of time and also money that people are spending on older games, free-to-play games, live service games is so imbalanced right now that, well, yes, I believe that your desire and the idealized desire to shift the mindset of gamers towards something that would be more healthy ultimately for the developers is an admirable one, and I agree. That is the hardest one to break because, frankly, it seems that is not the kind of games that people actually want. When Grow a Garden in Roblox has 21 million concurrent... No, something like that. 21 million concurrent players.
What the fuck are you talking about? Grow a Garden?
It's like a fucking Roblox game. Look up Grow a Garden concurrent players. It was the most played concurrent game of all time, I believe.
What the fuck? 21 million.
Okay, I got the number right? Okay, good. That is more than most games have ever sold. And the presumably very small team making that game within Roblox has made probably more money than most teams will ever make. And if that is where desire from gamers is to either spend their money on the safe yearly games, we see Call of Duty, EA Sports games sell consistently each year, or stick with what they know or what they can get access to for very cheap. You know, we see a lot of cheaper indie games that you can play with your friends do very well, and we see Minecraft maintain its player base. We see Roblox and Fortnite and League of Legends and Dota and Counter-Strike maintain their player bases. The unfortunate reality is that the value between time and money has been, for the majority of players, stretched so thin that to tell them that the healthy desire is to want literally the exact opposite of that is going to be incredibly difficult to break.
No, I mean you're totally right. But I think when I see a game like this Grow a Garden game, I'm seeing a game that made a different compromise than on scope. Yeah. They compromise. Well, I mean, this is obviously a game made by a couple people. I'm not too familiar with it, but it's a Roblox. And
first time you heard of it was on this show. I saw your face.
Yeah, inside a Roblox game, right? I'm imagining that not many people made this thing, right? So the point is they compromised elsewhere. It doesn't. Yeah. It's just something has to go. I think that's my feeling. Like part of the gridlocked place we're in the gaming industry and in the direction we're going on is because we won't compromise on scope or fidelity. But in reality, a lot of the most popular games compromise on one or compromise on both. That's definitely true. To be honest, correct. I think that
here's the fascinating part about that though is yes, a lot of the most successful games do actually ultimately sacrifice one or the other and see great success despite of it. But a lot of the teams that we want to see make these sacrifices, the reason why they are successful and have maintained their player base is because they don't do that, right? Yeah. Obviously, we're not saying that Rockstar should necessarily make smaller games that look worse or whatever, because we know that is what that team is known for. But it takes a retraining of the desire, not just with games, period, but within specific teams. The player base and the fans of certain teams and certain series have a understanding built up over years and entries and understanding of what they usually get from those projects, that's what you want from them. And so that's where another thing that's going to be very difficult to break is and what we were seeing with teams like Techland and Hangar 13 is trying to break that just a little bit, right, where they can make some sort of sacrifice and hopefully still reach their player base, but you have to do it slowly, because if Sony Santa Monica suddenly cuts their games to a 10-hour length, I mean, I'm sure that would be a fantastic game, but how would the player base react to that, you know? Like Sony Santa Monica can't make a grow garden. Even though it would, you know, the return on investment is immense, because there's an expectation from the Sony Santa Monica player base of what their games are going to be.
So I got an interesting factoid for you here. Assassin's Creed Mirage, which I thought was called Assassin's Creed Origins, which is making it really hard to find data about, sold 5 million units by the end of 2024.
Okay. That game released in 23.
Hold on. This figure is reported in early 2023. Hold on.
23?
No.
The game came out?
Hold on. Pause.
When did that game come out?
Hold on. Let me read the sentence.
I believe that game came out in 2023.
January. Hold on.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, no. Sorry. Fuck.
What's your point?
My point is that they sold 5 million units of this game before the end of 2024.
Okay, so the game's been out for 13 months, 14 months.
Yeah, but no. I've really fucked this whole thing up. Let's go back. Let's pretend I
didn't
mention Assassin's Creed. Assassin's Creed Mirage does a good little pop quiz for me. Releases in October of 2023.
Correct.
In the start of 2024, they report that they've sold 5 million units of that game.
Okay, wait, that's way more impressive. Okay.
Yes. What I'm trying to illustrate is that I think that there is precedent that you can find for these teams that are even making big games to find success by making smaller ones. Yeah. And obviously they go right back to massive scope. And to be clear, I'm saying they in a loose sense because there's multiple teams making Assassin's Creed games.
Yes, correct.
But then they have this team that's making their much larger in scope, more ambitious game, Shadows, which came out this year. Mm-hmm. And it was a success, it seems, but it certainly is not the barn burner that you would assume that Ubisoft wanted it to be.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think if you're one of the 001% top teams, your Rockstars, your CD Projekt Reds, your Nintendo EPD3s, your teams like this, if you want to fucking knock yourself out and take 7 years to make a game, at the end of the day, you know you are going to sell such an ungodly number of units that it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And that's fine. But I think that there is some evidence that we can find in games like AC Mirage that there is a way for even these biggest IPs to compromise on scope. And uncompromising vision is great, but an uncompromising vision isn't the only way to go. And I think that the other thing is we have to change our perception to where a 10-hour game isn't a compromise. It's the intent.
Yeah,
it's just a different intent, and I think that is doable. Look at Astrobot winning Game of the Year last year. Like I think that's meaningful. You can beat that game in 7 hours probably. Mm-hmm. It was a smaller scoped game, but people appreciated that because it was a tighter experience with a set of parameters that they really met the moment of, and they were uncompromising in those 8 hours.
Yeah.
And I just think that there is a route forward for big teams to make small games and to convince their players that the small games are worth buying.
Yeah. And also, again, another place where a sacrifice has to be made. Some things got to give in this conversation. Another place where that could happen is within the dev team, their publishers, their investors. I don't know how you do this. I'm not a finance guy. I'm not an investor in on any of these levels. But another place where you can sacrifice is saying, look, we don't necessarily know that this next one is going to be bigger and make us more money than the last. And at a certain level, someone has to be okay with that for a change to be made. I do think that it's exciting and interesting to see certain teams make these sort of smaller side spin-off projects that are expanding their scope and increasing their output a little bit. But then when you see someone like Remedy, whose games take a decently long time to make and they come out excellent, do a side project like FBC Firebreak and are not seeing a return on engagement and investment on that, more than likely, as far as we know, people are immediately saying they should never have done that. And I would imagine that Remedy's investors aren't particularly happy that they spent this time making this game that seems to not really be doing much for them financially. But also, again, as players and on our side, and we need to start to champion making that decision in the first place, rather than the fact that it didn't necessarily work out, because it was the risk that they took that is more admirable than it not actually being a financial success at the end of the day.
You got to get to a point. I think here's a metric I like. I think that if you get to a point where you can make a bad game and be fine, you're in a stable environment.
Yes, I agree. Mm-hmm.
Because I look at FBC Firebreak and I'm like, this looks, I mean, it's just not, that's not my cup of tea, right? I look at this and I'm like, I don't know what the deal is. And even they have admitted recently that they're doing a big update to improve onboarding because they had an issue with players getting past the first hour of the game. Like, they know they have a flawed thing on their hands, but also Remedy has diversified itself to where it's making deals with Rockstar to get these Max Payne remakes going. It's getting investment for transmedia Alan Wake and Control things. It's working on Control 2. There's a lot going on there, right? And they're in an environment where I think observational failure like FPC Firebreak isn't the last word in Remedy Entertainment. It's just simply a risk that they took.
A word.
Yeah, it's a word. It's a risk they took and didn't pay off. But I think that to do that you have to be in a healthy position, and I don't see a lot of teams in a healthy position, or they pull out incorrectly. I mean, it's not a problem I've ever had. But if you think about Ubisoft disbanding the team that made Prince of Persia, right, after modest returns, that to me is a sign of a really unhealthy environment.
Yeah, definitely.
And as much as I think that game is wonderful, we both had a great time with it. That's another game where they probably should have made that a shorter experience.
Sure.
You know, I just think that everybody, it's not anti-creative to cut things back. It's not a compromise.
Yeah,
and I think that you want, as much as I think that there's excesses to the current way in which the larger economic framework has made games worse and chasing profit has been bad, you know, you point to excessively priced microtransactions and skins, or point to big mergers and acquisitions that shouldn't have been allowed to happen. You want the companies you like to make a lot of profit. You just do. You want that money reinvested. You see that in Nintendo all the time. I mean, you weren't getting Emio in 2014. You're getting Emio in 2024, where there was so much cash circling Kyoto that they could let Sakamoto and Mages make that game, right? Yeah. You want Epic to make a fuck ton of money off of 9-year-old children buying Goku skins so they can make all of these triple I indie cool games that they're publishing. That's good stuff. You want that money reinvested so people can take risks.
Yeah. I feel that this conversation has flowed, but I think we also kind of lost sight of the concept of the crash, frankly. And I think let's recenter it a little bit on one of the only direct responses that we got to to this prompt that we shared with our community and others about the crash and what it would mean or could mean. And I've got my friend Eldug here, who is on the HitSave Discord server, who responds to my prompt about the video game crash, what it can mean in this way. He says, right now, we have gamers who say Nintendo is ruining gaming, Microsoft is crashing, and physical games, quote-unquote, should never die. But if we flash back to the 80s and 90s and we look back at what video games were and the culture, we'd see a drastically different market in response. Gamers didn't know about every single game that came out. We knew about it when it hit the store and if the store wanted to stock it. We were never suited to know about every single game ever and every video game coming out. 19,000 video games came out in 2024, according to rough research on Steam. And in 1994, 764 games came out. He says, I don't want to see layoffs naturally, but video games have absolutely oversaturated everything. And this is another thing that I think is actually, we were talking about parallels at the very beginning to something that you could draw a parallel between the current market, issues with the current market, and the problems of the early 80s with video games, is many low-quality projects flooding the market. In the 80s, that was very cheaply made, not particularly comprehensive or interesting software being put onto store shelves and taking up a lot of copies of them being printed. They weren't selling very well, taking up physical market space. And now we see, in a very different context, every single digital storefront, because of their openness, sacrificing quality for quantity, where you go on to the Nintendo eShop and maybe even a majority, frankly, of the games that you will see on sale or on just released recently are games that not many people would be interested in playing because they are very low budget, low effort, and many times involving generative AI games that are crap. If there's anything that I would use to describe the word, if there's anything I would use the word slop to describe, it would be these kind of games.
Yes.
I particularly like that word in many concepts or in many contexts, but that would be the context I would use it in. And that is one of the biggest issues that I see. I don't know what the solution is to that. Again, sacrifice has to be made somewhere, but I do think that, to L-Doug's point, one of the elements that I struggle with hardest in the current gaming market is how oversaturated the games market is, not necessarily with just a lot of games, but many of them being made as very quick and easy, get it on the store, hope someone spends $3 on it, because frankly they probably spent $7 making it.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point, and I think ultimately why I feel that we didn't end up that far off track in the conversation we've been having is that I think that a lot of the points that are talked about in the sort of circling the drain of a crash come back to player expectation, and I think player grievance that is not maybe the most, is not placed exactly right. I mean, I get what L-Doug is saying, but I just don't really believe that. I don't think that the problem is the volume of games. The problem is the discoverability tools. And I think that if you had a storefront that more effectively curated or put forth the games of actual substance from the games that are some variety of asset flip or scam, that this problem wouldn't seem as dominant. I mean, I think that oversaturation is doubtlessly an issue in the games industry, as it is in just the broader entertainment landscape we're in, where you have basically an abundance of choice at any given time, not in any particular medium, but across all of them combined.
Of course, yeah.
But you go back to the 80s and the 90s. 1994, 764 games. I bet there's a much higher percentage of those that are poor than. Well, this isn't true. Never mind.
No,
strike that from the record. But the point is, there's
probably commensurate.
There was shit then. I mean, I just don't. This point about volume of games, I just don't take as an issue in the volume. It's an issue in what's put forth. It's not like people weren't making fucking freeware nonsense games 20 years ago, but they were online. They weren't competing for Windows space. And I understand that that's a fundamentally different thing, and that's a problem for indie devs, but I just don't think it's germane to this conversation. I just think that discoverability tools need to be improved across every platform, especially Nintendo's platforms. Yeah. But I don't know. L-Doug, sorry, not L-Dog. You're my dog, but you're L-Doug.
Well, I think this is a very interesting point to bring up as something that is a major issue in the current industry. But the reason why I find this one a little bit hard to bring directly into the conversation we were having about a hypothetical video game crash is because I don't think that this could cause a crash, because the reality is these games aren't selling very well and aren't particularly relevant. And so, yes, there are a lot of them, but the amount of mind share they're taking up, the amount of market share they're taking up is so small that ultimately the impact that they have is surprisingly minimal given their quantity. And so it's like, yeah, there's a lot of it, but like surprisingly, I don't think it's actually having as big of an impact as you might expect.
I think it's a negligible impact on the games and companies that dictate whether or not there'd be a crash or not. And
also true, yes. Because that's actually one thing, is like, if there was a crash and let's just say Microsoft and Ubisoft have to stop making video games because nobody's buying their stuff anymore, that doesn't mean that people can still make AI asset flip games and put them on these storefronts.
And also, those asset flip games are not impinging on the ability of Ubisoft to market Assassin's Creed.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Like, again, this is a problem for indie devs, but I don't think that indie devs are, frankly, and I don't mean this in a disparaging way, but I don't think that they're germane to whether or not the industry is crashing or healthy or unhealthy or anything.
That is definitely true.
I think that that's a separate conversation, and I ultimately think that the problem... What I was trying to say earlier and phrase poorly was that back in 1994, the prevalence of bad slop games, not that slop existed in the same way, but just bad shovelware titles, had a much more negative effect on the big games, which were literally placed behind them on the shelf in the store.
Yeah.
When E.T. was a big issue because they made so many copies of it, because in that day you would have just bought on the fact that E.T. was one of the biggest movies of your cultural moment, and then it turned out the game was completely awful. But the storefront issue doesn't exist in the same way. It disproportionately targets indies, which is really bad, but that's not going to lead to a crash.
Yeah. Are there any other responses or conversation points that you want to make sure we hit for this discussion?
No, I think ultimately, just for me, the benefit of this is just helping us think about, as a broader community, what we mean when we say that the crash could be coming, what sort of some food for thought about why it might not be coming would be, and then also sort of where we as players could be reconsidering our expectations or our preferences to do what we can to also push for something that's a little bit more sustainable.
Yeah.
Because I think it's important to do that as well. And it's a much larger conversation about just consumer habits in games, but I just think that there's a lot of consumer habits that lead to the situation we're in.
Definitely.
Vocally going on social media and saying you're not going to buy Star Wars Jedi because the frame rate isn't solid enough for you, or judging and reviewing games based on the volume of their content. I just think that we incentivize structurally the industry to keep prioritizing things that's not to the broader health of the games and then to our best interests as players. The issue rests with the studios, and particularly the publishers and the executives at the studios and publishers. But I think there's also a fair argument to be said that as players we can help to steer things in a different direction too.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So to sort of sum things up, is a crash coming? I don't think so. Frankly, I don't think it's possible.
Yeah.
And also, given what we're talking about with, if major teams were to close, not only would we then be kind of even in a comparatively worse position, if we consider the bad things that are happening now to be these mass layoffs and loss of talent, a crash would actually cause those in an even stronger way. And I think would cause more damage than potential good. And also, it just, things are frankly too established now for that to happen. If there was a crash, we'd be looking at people not being interested in video games anymore, which I don't really think is possible because they're just a part of culture now. It's an expected thing that most people engage in the medium in some way.
100%, and I just think that it's all entertainment mediums are having trouble right now. They all are. The financials of it is precarious. But the reality is the precarious is going to stretch and stretch and stretch, and the ones that are going to stay standing, I think, are the ones that are the most shrewd in the uneven environment. A lot of people in Japan, some studios in Europe. So we'll see what happens. But I agree with you. There's no crash coming. We're just in the status quo right now is just bad. I think it's as simple as that.
Yeah, there's also no crash coming because they turned Vicarious Visions into Blizzard Albany.